I'm Dana Bell, and welcome to the very first episode of Shut Up and Listen. I'm here, I'm the host. Behind me, if you're on YouTube, you can see this. My cat, Michelin, is going to be here probably for the remainder of the episode or until I accidentally knock him off my chair. This is Shut Up and Listen. Basically, I'm going to talk about things that I find interesting, things that are interesting. And your job, dear listener, is to shut up and listen. And hopefully also find what I'm saying interesting as well. So for today's first episode, I'm going to be starting by talking about how in March, Zack Snyder came out with his cut of the Justice League. And if you haven't already seen it, you can go ahead and pause right now and go watch it. It's on HBO Max, or maybe don't, because it's 4 hours long. It's a 4-hour and 2-minute long movie. And before I go on, I want to preface by saying that I've watched it twice. I have spent 8 hours of my life watching the Zack Snyder cut of the Justice League. So yeah, I think I'm kind of like the authority on the topic, but I thought it was really interesting for 3 reasons. First, because it was 2 hours longer than the original one. For whatever reason. And second, because it was actually better, which is like really unexpected because everybody who's seen it has like gone in and come out and been exactly how I am now and said like, it was 4 hours long. It was the longest movie I've ever been to. And you're like, oh no, that sucks. And they're like, right. And then you're like, well, was it good? And they're always like, yeah, it was pretty good. So, but yeah, it was pretty good. Probably for the third reason that it was interesting, which is that it was rated R. And I don't really know why that was, because honestly, the only really intense thing was that Batman said the F word. All of the violence in it wasn't really that serious, aside from the fact that Snyder like lowered the saturation on the film, so it seemed a little bit more gory than the average comic movie. But it really made me wonder, like, who decides when something's going to be rated R? Because when I saw it on HBO Max, like the cover of it is in black and white. So I was like, is it going to be like The Lighthouse? Are they going to fillet Aquaman? I don't know what's about to happen here. It's 2 hours of extra footage. But it really made me wonder, like, who decided that people under 17 can't watch Batman say the F word? And I have no idea. So it's the end of the episode. I'm just kidding. I know exactly who rates movies. I know a lot about it. And that's what today's episode is going to be about. So buckle up, listener, because we're about to learn a whole lot about movie ratings. So it all started in 1896. And as with all great things, it started with Thomas Edison. Because fun fact, Thomas Edison was basically like the Elon Musk of his time. Okay, and that's not a compliment to either of them. But it is to say that Thomas Edison just made stuff constantly. And every time he made something, people were like, why? So in 1896, Edison made a movie, 23 seconds long, if you want to call it a movie. And it was called The Kiss. And in it, 2 people kiss, which is very, very scandalous for a time period that doesn't let women vote. So a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, Thomas Edison, why did you do that? And he just like laughed it off and didn't do anything. So in 1922, a lot of time passes and people are kind of not really sure about how to regulate movies because it's a new invention for the time. It's just like the internet is now. People have no idea what is and isn't okay to put out in theaters. So in 1922, in an attempt to keep the government out of movie theaters, this just guy named William Hayes starts up the Motion Picture Association of America. And you've all seen it. If you think you haven't seen this association or you've never heard of it, you have. It's that like eyeball looking logo at the end of every single movie that you've literally ever seen. So that's the MPAA, and they've been around since 1922, and they're not a government organization. It's actually really interesting because they exist. There is no movie in the United States that's banned. Because of the MPAA's existence, we're actually able to keep movies completely up to the consumer, and regular people decide whether or not a movie is appropriate for the movie theater. But that also has a few downsides. Specifically because the MPAA was, once again, just started by a normal guy who didn't really have any authority on the topic. And so when he started the MPAA, it was nothing like we currently have right now with movie ratings like G and PG and PG-13. It was just called the Hays Code. And it was literally just a list of things that you couldn't do and things that you could do, but you had to be kind of careful about how much you did it. And when it came to this code, studios didn't really follow it because it was pretty unfair. And the list of things that you couldn't do was for some reason less serious than the things that you could do. Like for example, in the list of the don't do's in 1927 included no blasphemous profanity. I get it. I can't do that either. No nudity, no drug trafficking, no sexual perversion, which means you're not allowed to be gay, no interracial relationships, no ridicule of the clergy, and you're not allowed to film childbirth. Which is just an interesting one that I included because it's like, why did they make that a rule? Did it happen so many times that they needed to make it a rule? I have no idea. And it was really funny because the be carefuls list was way more harsh than the you cannot do this at all. Like it was gruesome violence and like using guns were on the be careful list. I can't even list some of the things that were on the be careful list because they were that much more graphic than the things that straight up were not allowed. And so in 1928, only 42 of 572 movies that were submitted passed the code. So basically, you can kind of imagine that Hollywood was probably pretty cool, considering all the things that were not allowed whatsoever. And a lot of historians actually think that movies used to be much, much more diverse because at the same time in Germany, there were scores of LGBTQ movies being released, movies about gay rights and about gay relationships. Whereas in the United States, it wasn't allowed whatsoever. So a lot of historians think that we missed out on a lot of really cool movies because of the Hays Code. Most Americans agreed, which is why in 1968, the rating system was completely refurbished. Everyone was like, I thought that this was meant to prevent censorship. Why are we not allowed to see any movies whatsoever? So in 1968, then president of the MPAA, Jack Valenti, completely replaced the rating system. And it looked a lot more like what we know it to look like now. It had G for general audiences, that was anybody could go. M for mature, kind of like with video games, but not quite as serious as it means for video games now. R, which meant if you're under 16, you cannot go unless you're with an adult. And then there was also X, which meant nobody under 16 is allowed in the theater at all. And that was a really big issue because, again, remember, the MPAA is not a governmental organization, and they also didn't trademark any of their ratings. So basically, any movie maker could just come out and be like, my movie is rated X, it's super mature. And the MPAA and the government couldn't do anything to be like, hey, they're not actually rated. Just anybody was allowed to do that. And so porn studios started using X to describe their movies. And it became very closely associated with graphic nudity. And so the MPAA, realizing that anytime it gave a mature movie the X rating, nobody would go to see it because they assumed it was pornographic, decided then in 1970 to change R and X and just make X and R the same rating. So R just meant anybody under 16 was not allowed to go in, but also they could go in without a parent or with a parent. There was also confusion about what mature meant, so that became what we now know to be PG, and it just basically meant like, you can bring your kids. If you're a sensitive parent, don't bring them maybe. And everything was totally fine until the 1980s when Steven Spielberg came out with a series of movies. We've probably seen all of them. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Jaws, and Gremlins. Now, if you can look up any of those movies right now, and anybody who's seen them knows that they're kind of graphic. Jaws especially is pretty graphic, and it's only rated PG because PG-13 didn't exist yet. And the raters at the time all agreed that you can't really rate Jaws R because it wasn't that bad, but it also had like decapitated heads in it. So I don't know about you, but I think you should be at least 13 until you're allowed to see a decapitated head. And the MPAA agreed. So after Steven Spielberg himself actually suggested that the MPAA add the PG-13 rating, they agreed, and PG-13 got made, and now we have movies for teenagers. So now we know what all of the movie ratings are, but we don't really know exactly how they decide them. But luckily for all of us, I know. It is CARA. The Classification and Ratings Administration is like a subsection of the MPAA, and literally what it is. And I called them and I interviewed Joan Graves a couple of years ago for a separate project because I'm insane, and we talked about how they rate movies. And CARA is literally a group of about 20 parents. They cannot release any information about who the movie raters are because it's such sensitive information. You know, you're determining what audience a movie is going to be allowed to be showed to. So nobody knows who rates movie ratings. All we know is that everybody who does it, the only requirement is that you are a parent of someone between the ages of 15 and 22, which I just think is really, really interesting. And basically, what Kara does is every single day they sit down in a room and they watch like 10 movies and they rate them. And they just decide, like, based on a checklist of requirements and, you know, do's and do nots and like be carefuls of deciding. They eventually come together and agree on like what the movie deserves to be rated. And if they want to rewatch certain parts of it, they can go back and rewatch it, but everybody eventually has to agree on what the rating should be. And so that's why, like in the 80s, Jaws eventually became PG because even though some parents agreed that it should be R, not everybody agreed. And because it's an all or nothing kind of thing, it will usually revert to the lower rating so that more people can see the movie. But it's also kind of worrying that the system is completely anonymous because you might not realize it, but these people have a lot of control over what we as Americans deem to be morally acceptable, and a lot more than we might realize. Back to the Future, released in 1985, was originally rated R. Now it's PG, but it was first, like, they first agreed to rate it R because there was a deleted scene in the movie where Marty McFly was talking about going back to the future. And he said, actually, quote, "What if I go back to the future and end up being gay?" And Kara didn't like that at all. And they actually rated the movie R, and the studio eventually took that scene out and it became PG. But it's just things like that. Like, there are movies that nowadays we would be like, that's not a serious thing at all for that movie to have in it, that back then would have made it rated R. So if you actually go back and look at movies that are rated R, like pre 1990, they're usually not that bad. Cheech and Chong Things Are Tough was a movie that was released in 1982 and it got rated R. And one of the reasons that the raters put down was because at one point in the movie, they dress up like women. But aside from that, it's not much worse than any Seth Rogen, James Franco PG-13 movie that we would watch nowadays. But it's also really great because, again, there's no such thing as a banned movie in the United States because we leave it up to a group of hopefully competent parents to decide what everybody in the United States is capable of handling. And one more fun fact about the system of rating movies is that they're actually not allowed to watch emotionally jarring movies too many times in one day. So like if they watch one really sad movie, they're not allowed to watch any more sad movies for the day because it can make them really sad. Or if they watch a really gory movie, it has to be immediately followed up by like a children's movie. And then they get to watch like a children's movie to make themselves feel better about it. So presumably, whoever had to watch Zack Snyder's Justice League was not allowed to watch another 4-hour long movie directed by an egomaniacal director afterwards. So in the end, the real question is who had to sit through the entire Justice League, all 4 hours of it, and then rate it? Do you think they fell asleep? I would fall asleep. because honestly, the movie was not that different from the original. There's maybe like a couple extra scenes. Like it's like he added like every other second to the film, and that added up to 2 hours of extra movie. But there's really not that much different about it. So I feel as if they just woke up to Batman saying the F word and they were like, R, I guess. Anyway, that's Shut Up and Listen. Thank you for shutting up and listening. I'm your host, Dana Bell. I hope you learned something today. And if you didn't, oh well, that's too bad. I wanted to give a quick shout out and thank you to the producers, Ben and Christian, for putting this together. I had a great time. Michelin had a great time. I hope you, dear listener, also had a great time. And hopefully we'll see you next time.